I put my 74-year-old mother in a nursing home without telling my siblings, even after promising I'd never send her away. I signed the papers alone, then told everyone I was too exhausted to keep caring for her. Before we go on, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. I signed the admission papers while my hands trembled and no one else was in that room. It wasn't a dramatic scene like in movies. No one shouted. There were no arguments or tears at that moment, just the sound of the pen scratching on the paper and my name repeating on forms that seemed endless. I cared for her alone for years, I decided in a day, and they judged me as if they had always been there. The promise they reminded me of changed everything in front of her, but that day I didn't know it yet. That day I was just tired in a way that sleeping no longer fixes. I'm Elena. I'm 39 years old, and the conflict erupted during a family meeting at the hospital, although the story began much earlier, in a house that stopped being a home and became a permanent shift. For years, the routine was always the same, so automatic that I stopped thinking about it. The alarm clock would go off before dawn. I'd prepare the medication with a precision I was afraid of losing. I'd clean, cook, check rugs, corners, edges, anything that could make her fall. My mother, Marta, was 74 years old, and her deterioration was slow but steady, like a leak that no one repairs because it doesn't make enough noise. I heard it all the time. My siblings, Julian and Veronica, lived in other cities. They weren't monsters. They'd call, ask how everything was going, offer opinions. Sometimes they'd come for a weekend and say she looked better than they imagined, as if that were good news. I'd nod. I didn't have the energy to correct them. They'd leave, and the house would close in on me again with its long nights and identical days. At first I told myself I could handle everything, that it was my responsibility, that no one was forcing me. I had promised I'd never take her to a nursing home, and I said it with conviction, even with pride. That promise was born in an old conversation when her condition was different, and I was too, when I still slept 8 hours straight, and tiredness wasn't an identity. Over time the burden became physical and mental. I stopped seeing friends without realizing it. I reduced my work hours until my bank account started to notice. I normalized living exhausted, as if it were a phase, and not a permanent condition. The trigger came without warning, although now I know everything was pointing to it. A severe episode, a fall, the ambulance, the hospital. The doctors talking among themselves in that low voice that no longer reassures anyone. They said words I had avoided for months. Specialized care, continuous monitoring, a prepared environment. They didn't say nursing home immediately, but it hung in the air like a forbidden word. While my siblings discussed options over the phone, I spent the nights sitting in a chair next to her bed watching her breathe. In those hours I started researching nursing homes, talking to medical staff, asking uncomfortable questions. No one wanted to name the reality. So I named it. I made the decision to admit her without consulting them. It wasn't an impulse. It was the result of months of accumulated exhaustion that no one saw because it wasn't on video calls. I thought they would understand when they saw the full picture. I thought wrong. The family meeting took place at the hospital in a small room that smelled of disinfectant and old coffee. I spoke first. I explained the decision in a voice I didn't recognize as my own. I talked about safety, medical attention, limits I could no longer sustain. Julian listened in silence, with his arms crossed, as if he were waiting for something. When I finished, he took out his phone. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't make a scene, he just showed old messages, screenshots of conversations where I wrote that I would never take her to a place like that. He read them out loud, one by one, like evidence. Marta was present. She didn't understand all the details, but she understood the essential.
She cried.
She said she felt abandoned. That was the exact moment when something broke. There was no turning back. I tried to explain that promises are made with the information of that moment, that I couldn't do it alone anymore, that the hell of exhaustion also counts. It sounded like an excuse even to me. Veronica spoke of selfishness, Julian of betrayal. The discussion became collective and old. Who helped more? Who left first? Who offered opinions without being there? No one denied that I had cared for her alone, but that didn't outweigh the broken promise. It was then I understood that I wasn't defending a decision. I was on trial, and they had already reached a verdict before sitting down with me. When the meeting ended, the admission went ahead. I left that room with the feeling of having lost something I still couldn't name. I walked down the hospital corridor aimlessly, listening to my footsteps, wondering at what point caring had become proof that I hadn't cared well. And as I signed the last missing paper, I knew none of this was going to end. There the admission began to take shape, as things that can no longer be undone take shape. There was no ceremony or solemn farewell, just a date, a time, and a list of things to bring. Comfortable clothes, documents, personal belongings. I was surprised at how short the list was, as if a life could be summed up in a medium-sized bag and a folder. The following days were a succession of paperwork and uncomfortable silences. Julian and Veronica were strangely efficient. They'd call the nursing home, ask for reports, ask technical questions. I watched from the sidelines, still believing we were all doing this together. No one explicitly told me that I had ceased to be part of the decision-making center, but it began to show in small details. Conversations that would stop when I entered the room, messages in groups where they would reply to each other, and I would be left on read. Marta was transferred on a gray morning. I accompanied her in the ambulance. She held my hand during the journey and said nothing. That silence weighed more than any reproach. Upon arrival, the staff was kind, professional, prepared. Everything the doctors had described was there. Adapted rooms, wide corridors, clear routines. Part of me was relieved. Another part felt like garbage for feeling relieved. The first few days, I visited her every day. I'd sit by her side, talk to her about small things, the weather, old anecdotes that she sometimes remembered and sometimes didn't. She was more stable. She ate better, slept better. That should have been enough to silence the guilt. But it didn't work that way. Each improvement seemed to be accompanied by a new distance between us, as if I no longer had the right to that peace. One afternoon, arriving outside the established hours, a nurse asked me to wait. She said it was the family's instructions. I thought it was a misunderstanding. I called Julian. He didn't answer. I called Veronica. She told me they had organized the schedules so Marta wouldn't get upset. That it was for the best. That we would talk. That we would talk became a common phrase that never materialized. On the next visit, I noticed changes. The schedules were defined, the decisions made. I was listed as a visitor, not as the main contact. No one explained to me when that transition occurred. It just happened. From caregiver, I became someone who had to ask for permission. No one said it as a punishment, but I felt it that way in every form that didn't bear my name. I tried to talk about it. I asked for a meeting. I said I needed to understand. Julian was clear, with that clarity that hurts more than shouting. He said that after what had happened, it was better for decisions to be made jointly, that my emotional closeness could confuse Marta, that she needed to be protected. I listened and thought about the sleepless nights, the falls avoided by centimeters, everything I had done without witnesses. None of that seemed to count now. Veronica reinforced the idea. She spoke of balance, of limits, of healing as a family. She used big words to justify something very simple. They had decided without me, this time to compensate for my having decided without them before. Poetic justice, I thought. Or elegant revenge. Marta started asking for me less. Or maybe she asked, and they didn't tell me. When we saw each other, she'd look at me with a strange mix of relief and sadness, as if she were better, but not entirely with me. One day, she told me the place was nice, that they treated her well. Then she added almost in a whisper that she didn't expect this from me. I didn't know what to answer. No explanation sounds good when you've already caused harm, even if you believe it was necessary. My siblings seemed more united than ever. They coordinated visits, took turns, spoke with the staff. They seemed like a functional family on the surface. I was left out of that orderly picture, like an uncomfortable footnote. No one denied that I had cared for her alone for years, but that became a historical fact, not a valid argument. I began to doubt everything, the decision, the promise, myself. I wondered if there really was no other option, or if I had simply reached my limit and chosen the quickest way out. Exhaustion leaves no visible marks, and that makes it easy to question, even for the one experiencing it. One night, returning from the nursing home after a short, measured visit, I sat in the car and didn't start it. I stayed there with my hands on the steering wheel, feeling that I had fulfilled something important and at the same time that I had lost my place in the family history. The mother was cared for, the siblings organized, I was alive, resting a little more. And yet, everything felt wrong. I began to understand that the decision hadn't closed the conflict, it had shifted it, and that the price wasn't going to be paid all at once, but in small repeated scenes, in hallway silences, in looks that no longer knew where to rest. I still didn't know how far that shift could go, nor what I was willing to lose to sustain a decision I still believed was necessary, even if it weighed more each day. As the weeks went by, I started to notice something I hadn't anticipated. The tiredness didn't disappear. It changed form. It was no longer physical. It wasn't my body asking for bed or silence. It was something else, harder to identify, as if I'd run out of a clear place to put what I felt. For years, everything revolved around caring. Now that axis had shifted, and I was still orbiting around something that no longer needed me in the same way. At first, I tried to fill the void with tasks. I went back to working more hours. I accepted commitments I used to cancel. I met up with people I hadn't seen in a long time. Everyone said the same thing, that I looked better, that I was more rested. I'd smile and nod, because it was true and it wasn't. I slept more. Yes, but every night, just before turning off the light, I returned to the same question. Always. If I was so exhausted, why did I feel worse? Now I started to mentally review every decision, every phrase, every gesture from that day at the hospital. I became obsessed with the exact moment Julian took out his phone, with the tone of his voice, with the way he read my old words, as if they were no longer mine, as if they had been written by a more naive, more confident person. I had also been that person, and that was part of the problem. I never promised anything again after that. I realized I had used promises as a way to reassure everyone, including myself. Promising was a way of not thinking too much, of closing discussions, of feeling like a good daughter. I hadn't considered that those words could become evidence against me when reality changed. There were days when I convinced myself that my siblings were right, that I should have spoken sooner, that silence was a form of betrayal, even if it came from exhaustion. I'd punish myself by replaying alternative scenes, conversations that never existed but that in my head always ended better. In all of them, I found the right moment to ask for help. In none of them did they really listen. Other times, however, indignation would take me by surprise. I'd remember entire nights without sleep, crises I resolved alone, medical decisions I made without consultation because there was no time. No one called me irresponsible. Then, no one reminded me of promises when my mother's body collapsed in the bathroom, and I was the one who held her, so she wouldn't hit her head. That part of the story seemed to be of no interest. Now, one day, without thinking too much, I started writing, not to send to anyone, just to empty my head. I noted down routines, dates, episodes no one else witnessed. I was surprised by the number of details I had normalized. Situations that written on paper sounded extreme. I realized I had minimized the emotional impact, even for myself. It was easier to say I was tired than to admit I was on the edge. During one of the visits, Marta was particularly calm. She talked about the food, the garden, a nurse she liked. I'd listen and nod, trying not to look for hidden signs. Before I left, she told me that Julian and Veronica were taking care of everything. She said it with gratitude. I also expressed gratitude because I didn't know what else to do. It wasn't a lie. They were there now. It's just that they had arrived when I could no longer hold it all together. As I left the room, I felt a pang of something like jealousy, and that shamed me more than the guilt. Jealous that they were taking good care of my mother. Jealous that they were now seen as responsible. I hated myself a little for thinking it. Motherhood, fatherhood, caregiving, all of that is supposed to be non-competitive. But family doesn't work as it's supposed to, it works as it can. There was an implicit update that no one announced, but we all acted on it. I stopped being the reference. I stopped being the daughter who knew. Now I ask things I used to resolve. Asked for information they used to give me without my asking. Each step back felt like a late correction, as if the family system was rearranging itself without considering the previous wear and tear. I often wondered if I would have done the same if I had had real support from the beginning, if the promise would have remained intact in a less solitary scenario. I never found a clear answer. The only clear thing was that the decision was made in a context that no longer existed, and judging it from the outside was convenient. The phrase that haunted me most was one that my siblings didn't say, but I did. I could handle everything. I repeated it for years like a medal. Now it sounded more like an ignored warning. Being able to handle everything is a virtue when you're left alone. One night, while sorting through old papers, I found a list of medications from 2 years ago. Seeing it, I felt a knot in my stomach. There were crossed-out names, corrected doses, notes in the margin. It was the silent proof of a burden, sustained over time. No one was going to read that list out loud to accuse me. No one was going to show it as evidence in my favor. And yet there it was, reminding me that my version also existed. I began to accept something uncomfortable. It could be true that the way I did it was wrong, and at the same time that the decision was necessary. They weren't mutually exclusive ideas. What hurt me most wasn't the disagreement, but the subsequent punishment, the way they pushed me from the center as if my tiredness invalidated everything that came before. I still didn't know how all this would end, if there would be a real conversation or just this slow attrition. But I began to suspect that even if the conflict was resolved, something was already definitively broken. And I wasn't sure I wanted to go back to occupying the same place if it meant promising again what I didn't know. If I could keep it. The conflict stopped being silent the day they notified me of a change, without really notifying me. It was a short message from Veronica, almost administrative. She told me they had spoken with the residents and that to avoid confusion, they would be the sole contacts for any medical decisions. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a fact. I read the message several times, hoping to find a hidden question. There wasn't one. I felt something like a free fall. Not because I wanted to go back to deciding everything, but because that gesture confirmed what I had been suspecting. I was no longer an uncomfortable part of the process. I was a risk to be managed. Someone who needed to be kept on the sidelines so the system could function smoothly. I called Julie and he answered calmly, too calmly. He explained that it wasn't personal, that they were trying to do things right. He said my emotional involvement could affect Marta, that after what happened at the hospital they preferred to avoid confusing scenes. I reminded him that I had been there when there were no scenes, when there were only emergencies. He didn't dispute that, he just said that now it was different and hung up. On the next visit, I confirmed everything. The nurse spoke to me as one speaks to an outsider. She gave me general, careful information. No details. When I asked about a recent medication adjustment, she told me they had discussed it with the family, not with me. The word family felt heavy, as if it no longer fully included me. Marta was sitting by the window. She looked calm, better than before. That was what disarmed me the most. If she had been unwell, angry, neglected, I would have had something to rebel against. But she was fine. She talked about the weather and activity they had done that morning. About how much her other children visited her. She didn't say it with malice. She said it like someone listing facts. At one point, she asked me why I didn't come as often anymore. I was silent for too long. I told her there were new schedules. She nodded as if she understood, but I noticed a shadow in her eyes. Not of reproach, of resignation. That resignation hurt me more than any direct accusation. When I said goodbye, I tried to hug her longer than usual. She responded, but with a stiffness that wasn't there before. I didn't know if it was because of her condition or because of what she had heard about me in conversations where I wasn't present. I left with the feeling of having crossed an invisible border. That night I received another message, this time from Julian and Veronica together. They informed me that to avoid confusion, visits would be organized according to a calendar they would coordinate. They said that way Marta would be calmer. They didn't mention my opinion because they weren't asking for it. I read it and felt a mixture of anger and exhaustion that left me motionless. I thought about replying, about writing everything I had kept inside for months, about listing every early morning, every crisis, every decision made alone. I thought about reminding them that if anyone had confused Marta, it hadn't been me, but that scene where they read old promises in front of her. I didn't write anything. I knew that any word would be used as another proof that I was the problem. I began to understand that the punishment wasn't explicit because it didn't need to be. It was in the form, in the limits, in the neat and reasonable way they were displacing me. They didn't kick me out, they ordered me out. I tried to speak with the resident staff. I requested a meeting. I explained that I had been the primary caregiver for years, that I needed to stay involved. They listened to me with professional attention and told me they understood, but that they had to respect what the family had established. I heard that word again, family, as if prolonged care didn't grant a right of belonging. The visit started to feel watched, not because someone was directly observing me, but because everything was measured, the time, the topics of conversation, my own body posture. I found myself holding back gestures, avoiding memories, being careful not to say anything that could be interpreted as a reproach. I became a watered-down version of myself, so as not to bother. My siblings, on the other hand, seemed relaxed. They kept to schedules, brought things, spoke with confidence. They'd found a role that didn't require prior exhaustion. I watched them interact with the staff, with Marta, with naturalness. No one asked them about old promises. No one reminded them of absences. The present had absolved them. One afternoon, while waiting for the elevator, I heard a nurse tell another that the family was very involved. She didn't mention names. She didn't have to. I felt a pang of irony. I had been the family for years. Now, I was a secondary detail. The breaking point came when I was notified of a medical meeting I wasn't invited to. I found out from Marta, who mentioned it in passing, not understanding why I was surprised. I called immediately. They told me it was a general update, that they would tell me later. They didn't tell me anything. When I asked later, I received a brief, filtered summary with no room for questions. It was then I understood that it wasn't just a logical consequence, it was a way of rewriting the story, of arranging the family narrative to fit better. I was left as the one who made the wrong decision and had to be corrected. They as the ones who came to bring order. I reluctantly accepted that I had no real tools to change that narrative. Any attempt to complain was read as resistance, any emotion as proof of instability. Silence became a survival strategy. I started going less, not because I wanted to, but because each visit left me empty. Marta was well cared for, more stable, safer. That was the initial justification for everything. Reality confirmed it, and yet the cost became evident in every goodbye. I wondered if this was the inevitable price of having decided alone. If justice, when it comes, always brings something else that wasn't in the account. I began to accept that I had lost the place I occupied, and that getting it back might involve apologizing for something I still wasn't sure I had done wrong. When I left the residence that last time before reducing my visits even more, the corridor seemed endless. I thought about the first night I stayed awake caring for her. I thought about everything that had changed, and for the first time I wondered if caring can also expel you from the story you thought was yours. The final stage didn't come with an explosion. It came with attrition, with that background feeling that doesn't disappear even when nothing specific is happening. The mother was cared for. That was a fact. The medical reports were stable. The staff spoke of small but constant progress. Everything was working, and I was no longer part of that functioning. My visits spaced out first by someone else's decision, then by self-protection. I started to measure how much energy each encounter left me with. Sometimes I'd come home with a strange calm, as if I had fulfilled something basic. Other times I'd come back broken inside, replaying minimal gestures, silences that didn't exist before, looks that seemed to ask for something I no longer knew how to give. Marta got used to the new dynamic faster than I expected. That also hurt. Not because I wanted her to suffer, but because it confirmed that my presence was no longer essential. She talked to me with affection, but with a certain distance, as if she had accepted a version of the story in which I had failed and then been correctly displaced. She didn't say it, she didn't have to. It was in her tone. My siblings moved with ease in their new role. They coordinated, decided, resolved. Sometimes they'd inform me of important things, sometimes not. There never seemed to be any explicit ill will. That made it harder to discuss. There was no clear villain, just a reorganization where I was left out. There was a day when I understood that there would be no reparation, that no one would acknowledge the previous exhaustion or apologize for the way they exposed me in front of Marta. The broken promise remained the central point of the family narrative. Everything else was uncomfortable context they preferred not to revisit. I accepted that my certainty wouldn't coincide with theirs. I still believed the decision was necessary. I saw it in my mother's stability, in her safety, in her rest, but I also understood that the way I did it left a real wound, not because I decided to admit her, but because I did it alone and in silence, and that silence was read as contempt. Justice, if there was any, came at a cost I'm still paying in every hallway silence, in every short visit, in every conversation where my opinion is no longer expected. My siblings feel united. I feel displaced. No one won completely, no one lost just a little. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if someone had asked me before how I was. If the prolonged care would have counted as an argument, and not just as a precedent. I don't know. The only thing I know is that I did what I could with the information and the body I had at that moment. Now I live with a constant guilt that doesn't quite fit the facts. A guilt that doesn't go away just because my mother is better. A guilt that doesn't disappear, even if I rationally know there weren't many alternatives. I did what was necessary, and yet it feels like a betrayal, and maybe that's the hardest part to accept. Story 2. I demanded a child-free wedding after my fiancé's son exposed my kiss with my ex and made me feel like an outsider in his home. Before we go on, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. I'm a 30-year-old woman with an 8-year-old son. I've always done things backward. First I was a mother. Then I ended the relationship with my son's father, who barely pays child support, and then I met the man with whom I thought I'd finally have a normal life. He is 34. We met 4 years ago, and I moved in with him 2 years ago. He also has a son, Brandon, 10. At first I thought we could be a modern family, the kind that appears in ad campaigns or streaming series. 2 functional adults, 2 kids learning to live together. How naive I was. From day one, Brandon looked at me like I was a misplaced piece of furniture. He didn't greet me, he didn't talk to me, he didn't even refer to me when he needed something. I really tried. I cooked for everyone, invited my son to share toys, made plans, but Brandon simply didn't want me there. My son, on the other hand, tried. He is sweet, smaller, more innocent. He'd lend him his things, offer to play, sometimes let him have the last slice of pizza. And Brandon, with all the coldness of a child who has already learned to reject, ignored him. My fiancé worked a lot. Too much. Double shifts, constant trips. I, with my part-time job, spent more time at home, and that meant I was effectively the one raising both kids. Can you imagine being responsible for a child who won't speak to you? For months, I tried hard not to make distinctions. I told myself Brandon was just a kid, that his behavior was normal, that he needed time. But over time, I stopped feeling like a patient woman and became an invisible woman. The worst part is that my fiancé never stopped to look. He didn't ask me how I felt. He didn't see the gestures of contempt. He didn't notice when his son subtly pushed mine or when he told him, "Go to your room," for no reason. And when I mentioned something to him, he responded evasively, "You're exaggerating. He's just a kid." And I thought, my son is also just a kid, but I'm teaching him to share, to yield, to get along. Why does Brandon have a license to be cruel? One afternoon, my fiancé arrived with a surprise. A PS Vita for them both to play, he said, smiling. I hesitated, but wanted to believe that gesture would help. Spoiler, it didn't help. Brandon took the console as if it were only his. He'd say it was his turn, that my son had already played. He locked himself up with it. When I asked him to share, he ignored me. When I forced him, he became hostile, until one day it happened. They were arguing over the console. My son approached, and in the middle of the struggle the console fell. Broken screen, screams, tears, and I exploded. I told Brandon that as the older one he should be more understanding, that if he didn't want to share, he should at least understand that the younger one needed guidance. I didn't reject him. Brandon didn't say anything. He looked at me with that silent contempt that had already become a habit and ran to his room. That night, I talked to my fiancé. I told him what happened. I begged him to talk to his son, to make me feel supported. He said yes, that he would do it. He didn't. And so the days passed as always. Me raising them alone. Me absorbing the resentment of a child who wasn't mine, while my son's biological father showed up from time to time, pretending he still had a place in my life, until one day, he rang the doorbell. It was him, my son's father. I hadn't seen him for months, and although I should have closed the door with the same coldness with which Brandon looks at me, I let him in. What happened next changed everything. He looked at me as if time hadn't passed. My son's father, same seductive tone, same rehearsed phrases. He said he just came to drop off some notebooks he had bought for the boy, that he wasn't going to stay, that he wasn't even going to come in, and yet he came in. My fiancé wasn't there. My son was in his room. Brandon too. I don't know what happened to me. Maybe it was nostalgia, maybe exhaustion, or simply the need for someone, anyone, to make me feel heard, seen, desired. We sat in the living room. He talked. I barely listened. But I did hear when he said, "You don't look happy," and I didn't know what to answer. "You're muted," he continued, "like you're not yourself," and then it happened. He approached slowly, as if he knew I wasn't going to stop him, and kissed me. It wasn't a passionate or a romantic kiss, it was a wound. A reminder of how broken I was inside, of how much I had given up, of how little was left of me. It lasted just a few seconds. I pushed him away. I didn't say, "You can't do this. You shouldn't be here." He nodded. He told me he was sorry. He left without arguing, as if he had already gotten what he came for. Confirmation that I was still vulnerable. I closed the door. I breathed. I went straight to the bathroom to wash my face. I thought everything had ended there, but no. When I came out, I knew immediately. I saw him out of the corner of my eye standing on the stairs. Brandon staring at me mute, still, like a child spy who had just discovered a very dirty secret. He didn't say anything, just went up the steps without making a sound and closed his bedroom door with a soft click, but it sounded like a gunshot to me. And I stood there with my heart pounding in my ears and my throat closed. Not out of guilt, not because of the kiss, but because I already knew that information wasn't going to stay in that house. And I wasn't wrong. That night my fiancé arrived late, as always. Brandon didn't greet him, didn't say hi. He went straight to his father, and with the same coldness with which he had always treated me, he let it out. "A man came today." She kissed him. Silence. My fiancé turned to me. "Who came?" "Nobody." I answered too quickly. "Brandon says he saw someone." "It was my son's father. He just came to drop off some things." "Did he kiss you?" "No." I lied. But my voice didn't help me. I was shaking. It was obvious. He didn't yell. He didn't get mad. He just said, "Are you sure?" And I broke down. It was a mistake. He left already. It didn't mean anything. You lied to me. I was afraid. Brandon hates me. Anything I do becomes ammunition against me, and that's why you make out with your ex in our house. I didn't know what to answer. I had no way to win that argument. Brandon appeared from the stairs again. He didn't say a word, but his face said it all. He didn't hate me for the kiss, he hated me from before. He just needed an excuse to say it out loud. That night we slept in silence. Him on the edge of the bed. I hugged my son, as if he were the last piece of something that was still mine. The following days were pure awkwardness. Brandon didn't speak to me. Neither did my fiancé. I kept cooking, sweeping, pretending we were fine, that everything was salvageable. Until one day, while we were going over the wedding details, I said what I shouldn't have. "I don't want kids at the wedding." Silence. "What?" he asked. "I don't want kids. I want a wedding without screaming, without running, without drama." "Are you including my son?" "Yes, no exceptions." And there I saw it. It wasn't anger, it was disappointment. A disappointment so cold that it hurt more than any scream. He is my son, and it's my wedding. I want to have just one day in peace. Just one day that is about me. I can't smile for photos with someone who despises me. And your son, he's going with me. It's different. He loves me.
He respects me.
He is on my side and Brandon isn't.
No.
Brandon hates me. And you didn't do anything about it. He didn't answer. He got up, went to another room, and I stayed there wondering if I had just saved myself from the worst mistake of my life, or if I had just destroyed the last chance I had to form a family. We didn't talk about it again the next day, or the next. The air in the house was thick, as if we were breathing ashes. My fiancé barely looked at me. Brandon pierced me with his eyes without saying anything, but I could feel him judging me, gloating in that power he now had over me. And the worst part is that he was right. It all started with a kiss I shouldn't have allowed. But in reality, it was just the spark that lit the bomb that had been building since I walked through the door of that house. Weeks before the wedding, we started handing out the invitations in silence, without comments, like two partners closing a deal they were no longer excited about. I had already said I didn't want kids. He had accepted. Oh, that's what I thought until one Friday night, he dropped a bomb on me. My aunt told me her 15-year-old son is going. That you already confirmed. I looked at him, swallowing hard. Yes, I let it slide. He's not a kid as such. He's just going to sit there. He won't be a bother. So it's not a child-free wedding, it's not the same. He's 15. He's not like Brandon.
Right.
He said with that icy calm that cuts deeper than a scream. Because Brandon is a bother. No, I didn't mean that. But you've thought it all along. You never wanted him here. That's not true. And then why don't you want him to go to the wedding?
Because he hates me.
Because he never gave me a chance. Because you never forced him to respect me. He's a child, and I'm an adult raising someone who treats me like garbage. The argument escalated. My arguments turned into screams. His into reproaches. I can't marry someone who excludes my son.
He said.
I'm accepting you with your son. But you can't even accept that for one day, just one. I want peace. I want to feel like I belong. This is my wedding too. And Brandon, what am I going to tell him? That his stepmother doesn't want him there. I'm not his stepmother. He never let me be. And then there was silence, a thick silence, full of truths too hard to repeat. He sat down, looked at me for a long time, and asked something I didn't expect. What if I said your son isn't invited either? I froze. That's not the same. He goes with me. He is part of me. Brandon is part of me. You can't compare. My son doesn't hate you. He doesn't make your life impossible. He wants this to work. And you want it to work? Before or after the kiss with your ex? Silence again. I knew that wound was still open, that it wasn't going to close so easily. It was a mistake, right? It was a choice. Just as it was a choice to invite your aunt's son and leave mine out. I'm tired of him having the power in this house, of you defending him even when he humiliates me. This is the only thing I'm asking for. 1. That this child is not there on the day we supposedly start a new life. And if I tell you that without him there is no new life, my hands shook. Then we shouldn't get married. I said it with my heart in my throat, not as a threat, as a diagnosis. He looked at me for a second that seemed eternal and nodded. Maybe we shouldn't. The conversation ended there, without reconciliation. Without further words. That night we slept like strangers. Not even back to back anymore. Each in a different room. And as I hugged my son in the dark, I thought that maybe, just maybe, the kiss with my ex hadn't been the biggest mistake of that relationship. Maybe it was staying in a house where I always knew I was the unwanted guest. 2 weeks before the wedding, the only thing left was the calendar marking a date no one looked forward to anymore. I didn't talk to him about the subject again. I was convinced I had been clear, no kids, no exceptions. And that included Brandon. And yes, it also included his aunt's teenage son, although I had let that slide out of obligation and to avoid another argument. My son, of course, was going to be with me. He was my son, my blood, my only constant. I wasn't going to separate from him on the day that supposedly marked a new beginning. But then he asked again, "Do you really not want Brandon to go?" "No, I already told you." "And your son?" Yes, yes. And you think that's okay? I looked at him tired, empty, exhausted from repeating the same thing over and over. I don't have to justify it. My son loves me, respects me, has done everything possible to get along. Brandon has only given me contempt since day one. I don't want that near me while I get married.
Is it so hard to understand?
And did you ever try to understand him? I always tried. Or didn't you see what I did these 2 years? I cooked, cared for him, treated him with affection, and he rejected me every time. He didn't even give me a greeting. What else did you expect? For you to love him? For you to accept him? Even with his flaws, not as a problem, as a part of me. Then you should also have accepted my son as a priority. But you never did. It was always Brandon first, even when he was cruel to him. You forget that his eyes dulled. The conversation wasn't just about the wedding, it was about everything we hadn't said in 2 years. I thought this would be different, he murmured. I also thought we could be a family. I pretended we already were. There was a long, awkward silence. The kind of silence that hurts more than any scream. So you won't be bothered and I'll skip it too, he finally said.
What?
If my son doesn't go. Neither do I. I didn't say anything. I didn't believe it until I got the email. Venue cancellation, catering cancellation, cancellation of everything. Everything we had put together, torn down in 24 hours, without a warning, without a talk, just automatic notifications informing me, one by one, that there wouldn't be a wedding. I called. He didn't answer. I went to his house. He didn't open. He later wrote me a dry message. It makes no sense to continue. I understand your son is your priority. I have mine too. I don't want to force you to accept someone you can't even tolerate. I hope you do well. Just like that, without drama, without tears, without even an apology. I replied, don't expect me to regret it. You never made me feel like a priority, neither me nor my son. If Brandon was the most important thing, you should have married someone who loved him more than you. Because, honestly, I don't love you anymore. I turned off my phone. My son was looking at me from the living room playing with an action figure Brandon never wanted to lend him. He approached and asked me, are we getting married? No, my love. Because Brandon got mad. No, because I don't want it anymore. And it was true, I didn't want it anymore. Not out of revenge, not out of pride, but because I understood something I had been ignoring from the beginning. You can't build a home where they never offered you a room. The wedding was canceled, and with it also everything we had promised, without knowing how to fulfill. There was no official announcement or statement for the guests. Just a chain of silent cancellations that said more than any speech. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just packed my things, the plants on the balcony I took care of, the mugs I had bought, my son's drawings on the fridge, stuck with magnets that no longer held anything. I went alone. He wasn't there. We had agreed I would go when he left for work. We were no longer a couple, just two adults dividing the remains of a half-built life. When I was about to leave, I heard the door open. It was him. We looked at each other, as if we were strangers, and in a sense we were. He was no longer the man I dreamed of a life with, and I was no longer the woman who accepted crumbs expecting gratitude. You came for your things, I nodded. You canceled everything. Yes, silence. You didn't even give me time to explain. I said, it wasn't necessary anymore. Do you really think I'm a witch for not wanting your son at the wedding? I don't think you're a witch. I think it simply wasn't your place. I tried harder than anyone. I made an effort, but he never loved me. And you never accepted him as part of us. You accepted me, my son. Did you ever defend him when Brandon pushed him, ignored him? Treated him like an intruder? He didn't answer. I raised your son when you weren't there. I cooked. I cleaned. I swallowed all the rejection while you looked the other way. And that justifies kissing your ex. Silence. He said it without rage, but with an open wound. No, I said. It doesn't justify it, but it doesn't condemn it either. It was a mistake, but it was a reflection of something deeper that I felt alone, completely alone in a house full of silences. And why didn't you say it? Because I had already said it 1,000 times. But you only listened when Brandon spoke. A few seconds passed. I know it wasn't easy, he finally told me. But if you were going to stay, you had to make room for someone other than you and your son. I also wanted you to do that for me. It never happened. We looked at each other. Two incompatible worlds that tried to mix without understanding that love isn't enough when rejection is involved. And now what? I asked him. Now to each his own. It wasn't even worth one last try. Not if Brandon was still a problem you wanted to eliminate. And if I told you I don't want to eliminate him anymore? I just want him to respect me. For you to respect me. He shook his head. That is no longer enough. Sooner or later you would have wanted to leave. Maybe, but not today. Then we're late. I approached the door with the bags in my hand. Before leaving, he said, I wish you the best. Truly, I looked at him one last time, and I hope someday you see that my boundary wasn't selfishness, it was protection. I didn't want to destroy us. I wanted to save myself, and I closed the door without tears, without broken promises. Just a final silence that hurt, but that at least this time was mine. I went back to the apartment I had left 2 years ago. It was just as gray, just as small, just as cold. But it had something the house with him never had room for me. The first few days were confusing. I'd wake up believing I was still there. I'd look at my phone waiting for his messages. I'd reread the itinerary of the wedding that was no longer going to happen. I deleted the folder, deleted the photos, put the unworn dress at the top of the closet. I didn't block him, he didn't reach out either. My friends, the same ones who encouraged me to stand my ground, now spoke to me with that condescending tone of someone who thinks they know it all from the outside. At least you were consistent. You couldn't live at war with his son. You saved yourself years of unhappiness, and yes, they might be right. But none were there at 3 in the morning when my son asked, Are we not going to be a family anymore? They weren't there either when I sat in front of the mirror trying to understand at what point I went from wanting a life with someone to planning one without him. No, I wasn't the bad guy. I didn't yell at his son, I didn't mistreat him, I didn't kick him out of the house. I just wanted someone to take care of me for once. Was it selfish? Maybe it was fair. To some, no. To others, yes, but it was real. He decided to cancel everything because I didn't include his son. I decided not to go back because he never truly included me. Not in his dynamic, not in his decisions, not when his son ignored me, not when I felt alone raising someone who rejected me every day. And the kiss, yes, that kiss was a mistake, but not because it broke a promise, but because it revealed a truth to me that I didn't want to accept. I was never ready to be part of a family where there was no place for me. Today I am still alone, without a dress, without a ring, without promises, but also without fear of looking back. I wasn't the bad guy. I was just me with my wounds, with my questionable decisions, with my boundaries. And if that made me lose everything, then maybe I never really had it. Am I the only one who has had to choose between herself and love? Was I selfish or simply human?